In the year 536 AD, something happened that people could not explain and could not escape. The sun still rose each morning, but its light was weak, cold, unnatural. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, eyewitnesses described a world trapped in permanent twilight. Days passed without warmth, shadows faded, crops refused to grow, summer felt like winter. At first people waited. Bad seasons came and went, but this was different. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The sky did not recover. Ancient writers recorded their fear in words that still survive today. They spoke of a sun that gave no light, of harvests that failed everywhere, of famine spreading across empires. Modern historians now believe that 536 AD marked the beginning of the worst climatic catastrophe in the last 2,000 years. It did not destroy the world in a single moment. It weakened it slowly, and from that weakness, civilizations collapsed. The first clues come from those who lived through it. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. In China, official chronicles described yellow dust falling from the sky and summer frost destroying crops. In Ireland, records mention years of famine and scarcity. These accounts came from regions separated by thousands of kilometers. Yet they described the same phenomenon, a sun dimmed by something unseen. For centuries, scholars dismissed these writings as exaggeration or metaphor. Only in the last few decades did science confirm what ancient people witnessed. Ice core samples taken from Greenland and Antarctica revealed massive spikes in volcanic sulfur around 536 AD. Tree rings from across the northern hemisphere showed almost no growth for almost several consecutive years. The evidence pointed to a massive atmospheric event. Something had injected enormous amounts of material into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight on a global scale. The world had entered a volcanic winter. As sunlight weakened, temperatures dropped dramatically. Modern reconstructions suggest that average summer temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere fell by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. That may not sound extreme, but for pre-industrial societies dependent on seasonal harvests, it was catastrophic. Crops failed almost everywhere. In Scandinavia, agriculture collapsed. Entire settlements were abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows a sharp decline in population. In parts of China, frost destroyed rice fields in midsummer. In the Mediterranean, grain production fell sharply. Food shortages turned into famine, and famine turned into social breakdown. Without surplus food, trade networks collapsed. Cities that relied on imported grain faced starvation. Governments struggled to respond, lacking both resources and understanding of the crisis. The darkness lasted not months, but years. The climate shock of 536 AD marked the beginning of a decade-long period of instability. Recovery was slow. In many regions, it never truly came. The ancient world had been thrown off balance, and it would never fully recover. As the climate shock of 536 AD deepened, its most immediate and devastating consequence became impossible to ignore. Hunger spread. In pre-industrial societies, food production operated with little margin for error. Most communities lived harvest to harvest. When crops failed for even a single year, survival became uncertain. When they failed repeatedly, collapse followed. By 537 AD, famine was widespread across large parts of Europe and Asia. Contemporary records describe years when grain could not be found at any price. In some regions, people resorted to eating wild plants, tree bark, and even leather. Livestock herds were slaughtered early, eliminating future food sources and locking communities into long-term scarcity. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations across northern Europe reveal abandoned farms and villages dating to this period. Burial sites show signs of malnutrition, particularly among children and the elderly. In Scandinavia, entire regions appear to have lost up to half their population. The effects were uneven but relentless. Coastal and river-based communities survived longer due to access to fish, while inland agricultural settlements suffered catastrophic losses. Trade networks that once redistributed food between regions collapsed under the weight of scarcity. As populations declined, labor shortages followed. Fields went unplanted. Infrastructure deteriorated. Recovery became increasingly difficult, even when climate conditions slowly improved. The famine of 536 AD was not a brief crisis. It was a demographic shock that permanently altered the ancient world. By the time the climate began to stabilize, the ancient world was already weakened beyond recognition. Years of famine had stripped societies of resilience. Malnutrition had compromised immune systems. Cities were overcrowded with refugees fleeing failed farmland. Sanitation was poor. Trade routes, though reduced, still connected distant regions. It was under these conditions that one of history's deadliest pandemics emerged. In 541 AD, just a few years after the darkening of the sun, a new threat appeared in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Plague of Justinian. The disease first struck the port city of Pelusium in Egypt, before spreading rapidly through trade networks to Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine world. From there, it moved across the Mediterranean, into Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of unimaginable scale. In Constantinople, thousands were said to die each day at the height of the outbreak. Bodies piled in the streets, graves filled faster than they could be dug, entire neighborhoods fell silent. Modern science has identified the disease as a form of bubonic plague, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death centuries later. But in the 6th century, societies had no understanding of contagion, no treatments, no effective quarantine. The pandemic returned in waves for more than 2 centuries. Combined with famine and climate stress, the plague killed tens of millions. It drained manpower, weakened armies, and destabilized economies already on the brink. The world of antiquity was not destroyed by a single disaster. It was undone by a sequence, and the plague was the blow it could not recover from. By the mid-6th century, the ancient world was under strain from every direction. Climate collapse, famine, and plague had already weakened societies at their foundations. What followed was inevitable. Political systems began to crack. The Eastern Roman Empire, known today as Byzantium, was among the hardest hit. Emperor Justinian had ambitious plans to restore Roman glory. His armies had reconquered parts of Italy, North Africa, and Spain, but these victories came at a cost. Famine reduced tax revenues, plague decimated the population, farms went unworked, cities emptied, and state income collapsed. Maintaining armies became increasingly difficult. Soldiers died not in battle, but from hunger and disease. At the same time, the empire's greatest rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire, faced similar pressures. Crop failures weakened rural regions. Repeated plague outbreaks reduced manpower. Decades of warfare between two exhausted superpowers drained resources neither could afford to lose. Border defenses weakened. As imperial control faded, local authorities filled the vacuum. In many regions, central governance lost relevance. Trade declined, roads deteriorated. Coinage disappeared from circulation in some areas, signaling economic regression. This was not the dramatic fall of Rome, with burning cities and invading armies. It was slower, quieter, and more devastating. Empires did not collapse because they were conquered. They collapsed because they could no longer sustain themselves. The world was transitioning, not into chaos, but into something smaller, poorer, and less connected. By the late 6th century, the ancient world was no longer what it had been. For centuries, the Roman and Persian empires had sustained complex systems of trade, governance, and culture that connected vast territories. Cities thrived, roads linked continents, knowledge circulated. Stability, though imperfect, endured. After 536 AD, that stability vanished. The combined pressure of climate collapse, famine, plague, and economic decline shattered the foundations of classical civilization. In Western Europe, urban life continued to shrink. Many cities that had once been centers of administration and commerce became little more than fortified villages. Literacy declined. Long-distance trade faded. In the Eastern Roman Empire, survival came at the cost of transformation. Byzantium endured, but it emerged smaller, poorer, and more militarized. The classical world of philosophers, public forums, and vast civic projects gave way to a defensive, survival-oriented society. In Persia, decades of war and disease weakened imperial authority, leaving the state vulnerable to future upheavals. The ancient balance of power that had dominated the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries no longer existed. Historians increasingly view the events beginning in 536 AD as a turning point, the moment when antiquity gave way to the early Middle Ages, not because of a single collapse, but because recovery never fully occurred. Civilization did not end, but an era did. For more than 1,000 years, the events of 536 AD remained a mystery. Ancient texts described darkened skies and failed harvests, But without scientific context, these accounts were treated as exaggeration or symbolism. It was only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries that technology allowed historians and scientists to revisit the evidence with new tools. The breakthrough came from ice core analysis. By drilling deep into ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, scientists uncovered microscopic layers of volcanic ash and sulfur particles trapped year by year. These layers functioned as a climate archive, a frozen timeline of Earth's atmospheric history. In the layers corresponding to the mid-6th century, researchers found unusually high concentrations of volcanic sulfate. This indicated not one, but possibly multiple massive volcanic eruptions around 536 and 540 AD. Tree ring data provided further confirmation. Across Europe, Asia, and North America, trees showed severely reduced growth during this period, in some cases nearly stopping altogether. Such patterns could only be explained by prolonged cooling and reduced sunlight. Together, these findings painted a clear picture. The world of 536 AD had entered a volcanic winter. Sunlight was blocked by aerosols in the upper atmosphere, temperatures dropped, and global agriculture collapsed. What ancient people experienced as divine punishment or cosmic disorder was, in fact, a planetary climate event. Science had finally given voice to the past. At first glance, the world of 536 AD seems impossibly distant from our own. There were no global supply chains, no digital networks, no modern infrastructure. Societies were slower, smaller, and more localized. And yet, the crisis of the 6th century offers a warning that remains deeply relevant. The catastrophe of 536 AD revealed how dependent civilizations are on stable environmental conditions. A disruption that began in the atmosphere rippled outward, undermining food production, triggering famine, enabling disease, and ultimately weakening political systems. What makes this event especially instructive is not its scale alone, but its invisibility. The people of the 6th century could not see the cause of their suffering. They experienced only its effects. By the time the true nature of the crisis could be understood, the damage was irreversible. Modern societies possess vastly superior scientific knowledge, but they are also far more interconnected. A disruption in climate, agriculture, or energy systems can cascade rapidly across the globe. The lesson of 536 AD is not that disaster is unavoidable. It is that resilience depends on understanding systems and preparing for their failure. History does not offer comfort, it offers perspective. And in that perspective, the events of 536 AD stand as one of the clearest examples of how fragile even advanced civilizations can be when the natural world shifts beyond expectation. Historians rarely agree on superlatives. Yet when discussing the year 536 AD, many use the same phrase, the worst year to be alive. Not because of a single war, ruler, or disaster, but because of what followed. The darkened sun marked the beginning of a prolonged age of suffering, Famine weakened populations. Disease finished what hunger began. Empires lost their ability to recover. What made 536 AD uniquely devastating was timing. The ancient world was already stretched thin. Long-distance trade networks were fragile. States depended on predictable harvests and steady populations. When climate shock disrupted these foundations, there was no buffer left. Recovery was slow, uneven, and incomplete. For many regions, the world never returned to what it had been before the sky darkened. The 6th century did not mark a sudden apocalypse, but a drawn-out ending, the fading of an era that had defined civilization for centuries. By the time stability began to re-emerge, the ancient world was gone. In its place stood something new: smaller kingdoms, reduced cities, localized economies, and a different understanding of survival. The Middle Ages were not born overnight. They emerged from the long shadow of collapse. The people of 536 AD did not know they were living through a turning point in history. They only knew that the sun no longer felt right. History remembers their suffering not as legend, but as evidence, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations can be undone by forces they do not see coming. The past does not speak loudly, but it echoes.